All right, welcome back to today's Explainer. Today, we're stepping into the shoes of historical detectives to unpack an absolutely massive collision, the clash between ancient Greek logic and monotheistic faith. Think of this as a relaxed lecture where we take some incredibly dense history and break it down into concepts that actually make sense.
Let's kick things off with a huge Socratic question to really frame what we're talking about today. How exactly did medieval scholars balance the immovable, concrete doctrines of religion with the pretty much unstoppable force of Greek logic? It's kind of like an epic intellectual puzzle, right? And it's one that has fundamentally shaped human history and literally how we understand the universe today.
So, here's our syllabus for today's Explainer. We'll start with faith meeting Greek philosophy, move into early Christian thought, explore the Islamic Golden Age, look at scholasticism and the Jewish synthesis, and then wrap it all up with the rise of modern reason.
Okay, Part 1. Faith meets Greek philosophy, the transition from mythos to logos. Can you imagine the absolute cultural shockwave back in 332 BCE when Greek culture just swept across the Middle East? To handle this wild culture clash, the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria did something brilliant. He actually merged Plato's philosophy right into the book of Genesis. He argued that when God says, "Let there be light," what's actually happening is the expression of the logos. You can really think of the logos as the rational source code of the universe. It's essentially the thoughts of God mediating directly with the physical world. Pretty mind-blowing, right?
Moving on to Section 2, Early Christian Thought, Navigating Will, Time, and Goodness.
So, as the Roman Empire is slowly crumbling around them, early Christian thinkers like Augustine hit this massive philosophical roadblock. Think about it. If God is all-knowing and has this grand providential plan for literally everything, meaning every single event is already foreseen by a divine architect, how on earth can you and I possibly have free will? Well, Augustine tackled this paradox head-on. He proposed that we actually possess two rival wills. One desires good, and the other, well, desires sinfulness. He believed it's entirely within our power to actively choose the good, with a little help from divine grace, of course.
And you have to consider the absolute resilience of some of these thinkers. Take the Roman statesman Boethius, for example. The guy is literally facing execution on conspiracy charges. And what does he do? He leans entirely into this Platonic concept of goodness. Sitting right there in his jail cell, he personified this concept in his writings as Lady Philosophy. He used it to prove that true happiness isn't found in fleeting material power. No way. It's found in ultimate virtue in God.
Which brings us to Section 3, the Islamic Golden Age, the intellectual explosion in the Muslim world.
By the 8th century, the Muslim world had stepped up to become the ultimate safeguard of ancient Greek and Latin texts, which sparked an era of just unparalleled innovation. To explain how we acquire knowledge from a total blank slate, the brilliant Persian polymath Ibn Sina came up with this beautifully simple analogy. He talked about a child dropping food from a high chair. Through external senses, like literally just seeing the food fall to the floor, and internal reflection, the child naturally moves from basic sensual observation all the way to grasping the highly abstract concept of gravity.
But Ibn Sina didn't stop there. He went much further. He meticulously categorized human knowledge into distinct types of propositions. We're talking everything from simple sense data, like seeing that grass is green, all the way to tested data that requires repeated observation. What he was doing here was laying down the precise groundwork for strict logical analysis and what would become empirical science.
If we break it down into steps, his methodology actually required a search for falsification. Does that sound familiar? 'Cause it should. It remarkably mirrors the modern scientific method we teach in labs today. Ibn Sina realized that just noting a positive correlation isn't enough. You have to actively search for cases where the effect doesn't happen if you really want to prove causation.
Naturally, this massive leap in experimental science sparked a fierce cultural debate. On one side, you had al-Ghazali, who argued that philosophy absolutely must remain strictly separate from faith. But on the other side, you had Ibn Rushd fiercely defending Aristotelian logic. He pointed out that Scripture itself explicitly commands humans to reflect intellectually on creation. I mean, this was a true clash of intellectual titans.
All right, Section 4, Scholasticism and Jewish Synthesis, Systemizing the Balance in Europe.
Meanwhile, over in late medieval Europe, the brand new university system was becoming this rigorous laboratory of thought. Scholars were systematically trying to weave philosophy and theology together into a movement we now call scholasticism. They asserted that a rational system of thought directly reflects the rationality inherent in the universe itself. Thomas Aquinas became the absolute superstar of this movement. He famously brought the vital work of Islamic and Jewish thinkers right into Christian universities to completely reinvigorate theology.
Aquinas is super famous for his 5 ways to rationally demonstrate God. His argument goes kind of like this. Just as an acorn naturally grows into a tree, meaning it acts to achieve a specific end, all natural bodies are guided toward their ultimate ends by an intelligent grand designer. He basically used the strict logic of the natural world to point directly back to the divine.
Around the same time, in the Jewish tradition, the brilliant scholar Maimonides presented this totally mind-bending concept to his students called negative theology. He warned them that God's infinite nature simply cannot be boxed into finite human words. Think of it like trying to describe a completely new primary color to someone. It's impossible. We cannot conceive of what God is. We can really only safely state what God is not.
Because of this, Maimonides argued fiercely against literalism. He explained that when Scripture calls God gracious or merciful, it's really just a figurative way for our very limited human minds to process the divine. It's merely an attribute of action, definitely not an attribute of essence.
And finally, Section 5, the rise of modern reason, the ultimate paradigm shift. So, the meticulous groundwork laid by all these medieval thinkers we've just talked about, that ultimately gave rise to the early modern era. Spanning almost 2 millennia, literally from Alexander the Great all the way to the 17th century, we can actually track the survival and evolution of human reason. This is the moment scholars began to openly prioritize mathematical observation over strict church authority.
And let me tell you, what a bold and honestly dangerous move that was. When Nicholas Copernicus used pure mathematical data to prove the Earth revolved around the sun, he was so utterly terrified of the church's reaction that he sat on his findings for over 2 decades. No way he was risking that. But once it was finally published, it permanently shifted the authority for truth away from religious consensus and squarely onto natural philosophy.
The Ethiopian scholar Zera Yacob perfectly encapsulated this new era. He argued that God endowed humans with pure intelligence, specifically so we could use reason to evaluate the laws of creation. And yes, that applied even if it meant using that very reason to question established religious doctrine and miracles.
So, what's the absolutely crucial point to take away from this explainer? It's that modern science didn't just magically emerge from a vacuum. Not at all. It was built squarely on the backs of these Jewish, Christian, and Islamic philosophers who painstakingly stitched together faith and reason over centuries. They are the ones who kept the flame of inquiry alive.
I want to leave you with this final thought to really ponder today. In our modern age of advanced quantum physics and deep space exploration, is the grand debate between mythos and logos truly over? Or has it just evolved? Thank you so much for joining me on this historical journey today. Keep scrutinizing the world around you, keep asking questions, and I'll catch you